Bombshell book, Revenge, Meghan, Harry and the War Between the Windsors, documents Meghan Markle's life from her early years through to her reign.
For years, Prince Harry walked away from the royal world to build a new life with Meghan. Many believed love would protect them from every storm. Now, a sharp new claim has cut deep. Tom Bower says a secret deal was made behind closed doors, and Harry may be left paying the price. One voice now says he is financially finished. This is not just about money. It is about trust, control, and who truly holds the power in their private world. Fans are divided. Critics feel uneasy. If this claim is true, then everything we thought we knew about their partnership may be about to change. Tom Bower and the door he finally opens. Tom Bower had always been the kind of man who noticed things others missed. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't make grand speeches or demand attention in crowded rooms. Instead, he sat quietly with his notebooks, his coffee growing cold on the desk beside him, and he watched. He watched the way people spoke when they thought no one was listening. He watched the pauses between words, the slight shifts in posture, the careful selection of phrases that revealed more through what they avoided than what they said. For years, this had been his work, his calling, his burden. He believed that truth had a shape, even when it was hidden, and if you were patient enough, you could trace its outline in the shadows. The years had taught him to be gentle with his discoveries. He had learned that behind every public smile, there were private tears no camera would ever catch. Behind every carefully worded statement, there were arguments that had raged behind closed doors. He didn't enjoy the idea of causing pain, but he had come to understand that some stories needed telling, not because they were easy, but because they were true. This story had begun years ago, though he hadn't known it at the time. It started with small things that didn't quite fit together. A timeline that seemed off by a few months. A financial arrangement that made no sense for someone who had once lived under the protection of systems built over centuries. Decisions that appeared sudden but must have been planned long in advance. He collected these fragments like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a floor, not yet sure what picture they would form. Something happened that we're not being told about, he had said to himself one evening, staring at the documents spread across his dining table. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. His wife had gone to bed hours ago, but sleep never came easily when his mind was working like this. He studied contracts that had been filed in obscure offices. He compared dates on financial records with public appearances. He read interviews from years past, looking for the moments when the official story seemed to bend under the weight of what wasn't being said. Each discovery was small on its own, but together they suggested something carefully constructed, something meant to stay hidden. The gaps bothered him most. There were periods where the public record went silent, where decisions were made without explanation, where changes happened that should have required discussions but seemed to have occurred overnight. These weren't accidents. Someone had worked very hard to make sure certain things stayed out of view. Then came the phone call he hadn't expected. A voice he recognized but hadn't heard from in years. Someone who had been close enough to see things, close enough to know the truth, but who had chosen silence until now. They met in a quiet place, away from windows and prying eyes. The source looked older than Tom remembered, carrying the kind of tiredness that comes from holding secrets too long. "I can't keep this anymore," they said, sliding an envelope across the table. Their hands were shaking slightly. People deserved to know what really happened. Inside were documents that changed everything. Papers that showed an agreement made behind closed doors, terms that hadn't been discussed with everyone they affected, arrangements that shifted control in ways that would matter for years to come. Tom read through them twice, then a third time, making sure he understood what he was seeing. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was evidence of decisions made in private that contradicted the public narrative everyone had accepted. It showed that the story people believed wasn't quite true, that important details had been left out, that the version of events everyone had been fed was incomplete. He sat with those documents for weeks. He checked their authenticity, verified signatures, confirmed dates. Everything was real. Everything was true. and everything pointed toward a revelation that would hurt people he didn't wish to harm. The nights became harder. He would wake at 3 in the morning, his mind turning over the same questions. Did people have the right to know this? Would telling it serve any good purpose, or would it simply cause pain? Was truth always worth the damage it might do? He had built his career on the belief that hidden things should be brought to light. But now, facing the actual moment of exposure, he felt the weight of what that meant. "What if I'm wrong to publish this?" he asked his reflection one morning while shaving. His face looked older than it had a few months ago, but he also knew what silence meant. It meant that false stories would continue to be believed. It meant that people making judgments based on incomplete information would never know they'd been misled. It meant that the truth would stay buried, and with it, any chance of real understanding. The decision, when it finally came, didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary, which was different. He would tell the story because it was true, because the documents existed, because someone had trusted him with information that mattered. He would tell it carefully, without cruelty, but he would tell it. Was the truth more dangerous than the silence that had protected it? Perhaps. But he had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing of all was a lie that everyone believed, a story that went unchallenged simply because challenging it was uncomfortable. He opened his laptop and began to write, knowing that once these words entered the world, nothing would be quite the same again. The price of certainty. Meghan had always been the kind of person who believed in second chances. Not just for herself, though she had needed plenty of those. She believed in them for everyone. She believed people could change their stories, rewrite their endings, and step into better versions of themselves if they were brave enough to try. It was a sweet kind of optimism, the sort that made her smile warm even in photographs, the kind that made strangers feel like she saw something good in them. She had built her life on that belief, turning each chapter into something brighter than the last, refusing to let circumstances define her future. When the opportunity came to sit down for private discussions, she approached them with the same practical mindset she had carried through everything else. These weren't grand negotiations in marble halls. They happened in quiet rooms, with careful words and documents that outlined possibilities she had only dreamed about: long-term stability, control over the creative work that mattered to her, financial pathways that wouldn't depend on systems she couldn't trust. It all made sense on paper. "This is about protecting what we're creating," she said during one of those conversations, her voice steady with conviction. She meant it. This wasn't about greed or power. It was about making sure that if everything else fell apart, she would still have something solid beneath her feet. The agreement felt like armor against an uncertain future. She had seen too many people left with nothing when circumstances shifted, when support systems collapsed, when the people they trusted walked away. She wasn't going to let that happen to her. Not again. This was practical planning, sensible preparation for possibilities no one wanted to think about but everyone should consider. But practicality has a way of feeling cold when you're making decisions alone. She weighed every option in those quiet hours when doubt crept in. What if she moved forward independently and discovered she had miscalculated? What if the plans that seemed so solid now turned to dust in her hands? But then fear would give way to something stronger. The fear of having nothing, of being vulnerable, of losing control over her own story. That fear pushed her toward certainty, toward signatures on documents that promised security. "I'm doing what I need to do," she told herself, and believed it completely. When the final papers were signed, she felt something like relief wash over her. The path ahead seemed clearer now, marked by decisions that belonged to her alone. She could move forward with confidence, knowing she had protected her dreams, secured her independence, built something that couldn't be taken away. The uncertainty that had clouded everything before seemed to lift, replaced by the bright possibility of a future she controlled. She stepped into this new direction with her head high, that familiar warmth in her smile, that quiet certainty in her posture. People who saw her then would have seen someone who knew exactly where she was going, someone who had made peace with her choices, someone ready for whatever came next. What she didn't see, couldn't see yet, was the cost hidden inside that confidence. Certainty has a price that doesn't always show itself immediately. It appears later, in moments you didn't anticipate, in relationships that shift in ways you didn't expect, in the realization that protecting yourself sometimes means walking away from connections that might have held you differently. The agreements that promised security also drew lines that couldn't easily be crossed again. The independence she had fought for came with a loneliness she hadn't quite prepared for. But in that moment, standing at the threshold of her carefully constructed future, she believed she had chosen wisely. She believed the armor she had built would keep her safe. She believed that controlling her own story was worth whatever it might cost. What price was hidden inside the confidence she carried? She would learn that answer slowly, in the quiet spaces between public appearances, in the private moments when certainty gave way to doubt, in the gradual understanding that some choices protect you from one kind of loss while delivering another you never saw coming. When trust becomes a question. Harry had always been the kind of man who loved with his whole heart. It wasn't something he advertised or spoke about in grand declarations. It showed in smaller ways, in the fierce protectiveness he felt for the people he cared about, in his willingness to step away from everything familiar if it meant keeping someone safe, in the way he believed that when you chose to build a life with another person, you built it together, completely, without walls or secrets or separate plans for separate futures. He had been raised in a world of duty and distance, where emotions were often hidden behind protocol, but somehow he had emerged from it believing in something simpler and more honest. He believed in partnership. He believed that love meant sharing not just the good moments but the risks, the rewards, the difficult decisions that shaped what came next. When he made the decision to step away from the life he had known, he did it believing they would face whatever came next as a team. Two people against the world, making decisions together, building something that belonged to both of them equally. He had given up so much to make that possible, not just titles or positions, though those mattered too, but the entire framework that had defined his existence, the structure that had held him, protected him, given him purpose and identity. He had walked away from all of it because he believed in the future they were creating together. The first signs were so subtle he almost missed them. Small things that didn't quite make sense, questions about finances that received vague answers, decisions about projects and partnerships where his input seemed to matter less than it once had, conversations about future plans that felt strangely one-sided, as if the "we" he kept using was slowly being replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name yet. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the stress of building a new life was making him see problems where none existed. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts. He noticed changes in how money moved, who controlled access to what, whose name appeared on documents that should have included both of them. Nothing dramatic enough to confront directly, but enough to create a low hum of unease that he couldn't shake. "Are we still building this together?" he asked one evening, trying to make the question sound casual, trying not to reveal the fear behind it. The answer he received was reassuring in words but somehow hollow in feeling. "Yes, of course, we're a team. Why would you even ask that?" But reassurance that has to be spoken often feels less solid than reassurance that simply exists in actions. The discovery, when it finally came, arrived not as a dramatic revelation but as a gradual understanding that settled over him like cold water. He was looking through paperwork related to future projects, trying to understand the financial arrangements they had agreed to, and he saw terms he didn't remember discussing. Details about how income would be divided, who held rights to what, how ownership was structured going forward. He read through it once, then again, then a third time, hoping he was misunderstanding something fundamental. He wasn't. The future he thought they were building together had been quietly reorganized in ways that changed everything. Rights to earnings from work he believed they shared now belonged primarily to one side of the partnership. Control over decisions he assumed they would make together had shifted without his full awareness. The financial foundation he thought supported both of them equally had been restructured into something that left him in a weaker position than he had ever imagined possible. "When did this happen?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The documents were spread across the table in front of him, and he stared at them as if they might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense, something that hurt less. The explanation that followed was practical, almost businesslike. These arrangements protected everyone involved. They provided security and clarity about the future. They were standard practice for situations like this. Everything had been handled properly, legally, with appropriate advice. There was nothing wrong with any of it, except that it felt completely wrong to him. He had never wanted to think about their partnership in terms of separate interests. He had believed that when you truly shared a life, you didn't need contracts that divided things so carefully that protected one person's assets from another's, that treated marriage like a business arrangement that might someday need unwinding. He had trusted that they were in this together, that whatever they built would belong to both of them in equal measure. The realization that this wasn't true, that perhaps it had never been true in the way he thought, felt like standing on ground that suddenly wasn't solid anymore. The pain wasn't just financial, though that mattered. It was deeper, more fundamental. His entire identity had been tied to service and shared purpose. He had been raised to believe that his value came from what he could give to something larger than himself, first to his country and family, then to this partnership he had chosen. He had given everything to both, holding nothing back, because that's what he believed love and duty required. Now he felt both financially weakened and emotionally isolated, standing in a future he no longer fully understood, wondering when the shift had happened and why he hadn't seen it coming. The man who had trusted love with his whole heart was learning that trust alone couldn't protect you from feeling betrayed. Can love survive when a sense of fairness is lost? He didn't know the answer yet. He only knew that the question itself was something he had never imagined he would have to ask. The document that changed everything. The agreement itself was not a dramatic thing to look at. It sat in a folder on a desk, looking just like any other set of legal papers people sign when they're planning a future together. Clean pages with careful language, sections marked with numbers and subsections, signatures at the bottom that proved everyone had agreed. There was nothing sinister about its appearance, nothing that warned of the weight it would carry in the months and years to come. But inside those pages was an architecture of control so subtle that it wouldn't be fully understood until it was far too late to change. The terms were laid out with the kind of precision that lawyers pride themselves on. They defined who would control the earnings from future projects. They specified how creative direction would be managed, and whose voice would have final say when disagreements arose. They outlined the structure of financial outcomes over time, detailing percentages and rights and ownership in language that seemed fair on the surface but tilted heavily in one direction when you truly understood what it meant. "This protects both of us," had been the explanation when the papers were first presented, and perhaps that was even believed by the person who said it. But protection is a strange word that can mean very different things depending on which side of an agreement you're standing on. Harry had signed without fully grasping what he was agreeing to, not because he was careless, but because he had approached the moment with trust instead of suspicion. He had believed that documents formalizing their partnership would simply reflect what they had already agreed to in their hearts. Equal partners building something together. He hadn't realized that legal language has a way of creating realities that go far beyond what was said in conversations. That the words on those pages would become more powerful than any promise spoken in private. The consequences began small, almost invisible at first. A decision about a project that Harry thought they would make together was made without his input. When he asked about it later, the answer was gentle but firm. "According to our agreement, this falls under my creative control." He didn't remember agreeing to that specifically, but when he looked back at the documents, there it was, buried in Section 4, subsection 3, using words he hadn't fully understood when he read them the first time. Money from work they had both been involved in flowed into accounts he didn't have access to in the way he expected. Not all of it, but enough that he noticed. Enough that when he wanted to make decisions about how funds should be used, he discovered his voice carried less weight than he thought it would. The financial structure they had agreed to meant that certain income streams belonged primarily to one side of the partnership, regardless of how much work both of them had put in. Options he believed were open began closing quietly. Opportunities he wanted to pursue required approval he didn't realize he needed. Doors he thought he could walk through turned out to be locked, with keys held by someone else. Each time he encountered these limitations, he felt a small shock of recognition. This was what the agreement had created. This imbalance wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was built into the very structure of what they had signed. "I didn't know it would be like this," he said one evening, his voice carrying a confusion that was painful to hear. He wasn't angry yet, just lost, trying to understand when the partnership he believed in had become something else. The agreement sat between them now, invisible but present in every conversation. Legal commitments have a strange power that emotional promises don't. You can break an emotional promise and apologize, rebuild trust, find your way back to each other. But legal commitments are different. They create frameworks that don't bend just because you regret them. They establish realities that continue existing regardless of how anyone feels about them. A contract doesn't care if you're sorry. It doesn't change because you wish you had read it more carefully or asked more questions before signing. Harry was learning this lesson slowly, painfully, in moments that accumulated like stones in his pocket. Each realization added weight he had to carry. The future income from projects he was involved in wouldn't benefit him the way he thought. The creative work he cared about deeply could be directed by decisions he didn't control. The financial security he had hoped to build was structured in ways that left him dependent rather than equal. The emotional distance this created was perhaps the most painful consequence of all. Conversations between them became careful, each word chosen with more thought than before. They talked around the agreement rather than about it, both aware of the imbalance it had created but unsure how to address something that was now legally binding. Trust, which had once felt natural and easy between them, became something that required effort to maintain. Harry found himself wondering about motivations in ways he never had before. Was this always the plan? Did she know what these terms really meant when we signed them? Did I give away my future without understanding what I was doing? She, for her part, seemed to believe everything was proceeding as it should. The agreement was meant to provide structure and security. It was protecting what they were building. If Harry was uncomfortable with certain aspects, well, those were the terms they had agreed to. Legal commitments had to be honored. That's how partnerships worked when you were building something serious, something that would last. But Harry was beginning to understand that legal structure and emotional connection were not the same thing. You could have all the right paperwork in place and still lose the person you thought you were building a life with. You could honor every term of an agreement and still feel betrayed by what those terms revealed about how you were actually valued in the relationship. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the weight of what had been signed continued to shape everything between them. The agreement that was supposed to provide clarity and protection had instead created distance that grew wider each time its terms were applied to a real decision. What had seemed like simple planning for the future had become a structure that limited one person while empowering another, creating an imbalance that neither of them seemed to know how to correct. Can closeness survive when understanding fades? Can two people remain truly connected when one discovers that the partnership they believed in was built on terms they never fully understood? The agreement itself couldn't answer those questions. It could only continue existing, page after page of careful language that had reshaped their future in ways that couldn't be undone by wishing things were different. And in the quiet moments, when they sat together but felt miles apart, both of them wondered if signatures on paper had cost them something far more valuable than anything those pages were meant to protect. The cracks in the marriage. The relationship had always been built on something beautiful and fragile at the same time. It was the kind of connection that made people believe in second chances and fresh starts. Two people who had both known pain in different ways, who had both felt misunderstood by the world watching them, who had found in each other a refuge from everything that had hurt them before. There was sweetness in how they looked at each other in the early days, a gentle protectiveness that seemed to promise safety. They spoke about building something new together, something that would be theirs alone, free from the systems and expectations that had constrained them both. It was a hopeful vision, the kind that makes people willing to walk away from everything familiar. But somewhere between the dream and the reality, their visions of that shared future began to shift in directions neither of them fully recognized at first. Harry saw their new life as something they would rebuild together, brick by brick, decision by decision. He imagined conversations where they weighed options as equals, where neither person held more power than the other, where the victories and struggles would be shared completely. His understanding of partnership had always been about standing side by side, facing whatever came with combined strength. He had given up so much to make this possible, and in his mind, that sacrifice was an investment in us, not just in escaping what had been. Meghan's vision, while it appeared similar on the surface, had a different foundation. She saw their future as something that needed careful protection, structures that would ensure stability even if circumstances shifted in unexpected ways. Individual security wasn't selfishness in her mind. It was wisdom born from experience, from having learned that relying entirely on shared arrangements could leave you vulnerable when things fell apart. She wanted control not because she didn't trust him, but because she had learned not to trust situations, systems, or promises that could change without warning. These two visions lived side by side for a while, close enough that the differences didn't seem important. But as time passed and decisions needed to be made, the gap between them began to show. The unspoken resentments started small, like seeds planted in moments that seemed too minor to address directly. A conversation about money where one person's concerns were dismissed too quickly. A decision about a project where consultation felt more like notification. A moment when Harry realized his opinion on something important had been noted but not actually considered in the final choice. Each instance was small enough to let pass, but they accumulated like dust settling in corners, building up until the air between them felt heavier than it used to. Silence became more common in their home, not the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill every moment with words, but the careful silence of people choosing not to say things that might start arguments they're too tired to finish. Disagreements went unresolved because neither person knew how to bridge the gap between what they believed and what the other seemed to want. Disappointment became a quiet companion at their dinner table, sitting between them even when they smiled for the sake of keeping things pleasant. "We're supposed to be doing this together," Harry said one evening, the words coming out more tired than angry. "We are doing it together," came the response, but they both knew they meant different things by those words. For Harry, the fear of being financially finished had become a constant weight. He looked at the structures they had created and saw himself diminished in ways he hadn't agreed to, trapped by choices he didn't fully own. The agreements that were supposed to protect their partnership had instead created a situation where his financial path was no longer truly his to control. Income, he thought, would support both of them equally, was directed in ways that left him dependent. Rights he assumed he shared were actually held primarily by one person. He felt the ground beneath him growing less solid each day. What would happen if things between them didn't work out? What would he be left with after giving up everything to be here? The questions haunted him in the early morning hours when sleep wouldn't come. He had walked away from security, from structure, from a life that had problems but at least had certainty. He had done it for love, for partnership, for the promise of building something better together. Now he wondered if he had traded one form of constraint for another, this one somehow more painful because it came wrapped in the language of protection and planning. "I didn't sign up for this," he said quietly, looking at documents that proved he actually had, even if he hadn't understood what they really meant. Meghan wrestled with her own form of accountability. Had she been wrong to protect herself? Was it unfair to create structures that gave her more control? Or was it simply practical planning that anyone in her position would have done? She hadn't intended to hurt him. She had only wanted to ensure that the future they were building wouldn't collapse and leave her with nothing. Every choice she had made seemed reasonable in the moment, justified by circumstances and advice from people who understood these matters better than they did. But she could see the distance growing between them. She could feel the resentment in his silences, the disappointment in the way he looked at her when certain topics came up. She knew he felt trapped, diminished, pushed to the margins of a life he thought they were creating as equals. And she didn't know how to fix it without undoing structures that felt essential to her own sense of security. "I was trying to protect us," she wanted to say, but couldn't quite manage because she knew he would hear it differently than she meant it. The question of responsibility hung between them like fog, making it hard to see each other clearly. Had the damage come from intention? Had either of them planned for things to turn out this way? Or was it fear that had driven choices? Fear of being vulnerable, fear of losing control, fear of being left with nothing if the beautiful vision they had started with fell apart? Or was it simply misunderstanding? Two people who loved each other but spoke different languages when it came to security and partnership and what it meant to build a future together. Who carries the weight when both believe they were only trying to survive? When one person's protection feels like another person's prison? When the structures meant to keep a relationship safe instead create the very distance that threatens to destroy it? They didn't have answers to these questions. They only had the reality they had created together, even if they had created it while seeing completely different things. Two visions of the same future, growing further apart with each passing day, each decision, each moment of silence that should have been filled with honest conversation but wasn't. The relationship that had seemed so full of promise now felt like standing on opposite sides of a widening crack, both reaching toward each other but neither quite able to bridge the space between where they stood and where the other person was. And the saddest part was that neither of them had meant for it to be this way. The final bombshell and what remains. The truth was never meant to stay hidden forever. Tom Bauer understood this in a way that made him both respected and feared. He was a gentle soul in many ways, someone who spoke softly and listened carefully, but he carried within him an unwavering belief that people deserved to know what was real. He had spent months gathering pieces of a story that didn't match what the world had been told, and when he finally released his findings, he did so knowing lives would change. The documents he presented were simple and clear, showing agreements that had been kept private, financial arrangements that favored one side heavily, decisions made without the equality everyone had assumed existed. Within hours, the story everyone thought they knew had transformed into something entirely different. For Harry, the revelation felt like standing in a spotlight he had never asked for, exposing wounds he had tried to keep private. Strangers now knew the details of his diminished position, the legal terms that had left him with less control than anyone imagined, the reality that the partnership he believed in had been structured in ways that protected one person far more than the other. He read comments from people who pitied him, and somehow that felt worse than the original pain. His private loss had become public property, something people discussed over coffee, debated in conversations he would never hear, judged without knowing the full story of how love and trust had led him to sign papers he didn't fully understand. "Everyone knows now," he whispered to his reflection one morning, and wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Meghan faced her own reckoning as the findings spread. The choices she had made for self-protection now appeared cold and calculated in the harsh light of public examination. Documents showed her securing advantages while her partner gave up nearly everything. The fear that had driven those decisions, the genuine worry about being left vulnerable, didn't translate into the stark language of contracts and percentages. People saw what she had done but couldn't see why she had felt it necessary. Couldn't understand the panic that comes from having lost everything before and being desperate not to let it happen again. She wanted to explain, to make people understand that protection isn't the same as betrayal, but there was no platform for that explanation that wouldn't sound like making excuses. The truth had been released, and truth doesn't care about context or intentions. It simply exists, forcing everyone to see what was real instead of what they wanted to believe. The noise that followed was deafening for a while. Everyone had opinions. People took sides. Arguments erupted about fairness and manipulation, about who deserved sympathy and who deserved judgment. The intensity of it all felt overwhelming, as if the entire world had decided to weigh in on private choices made in private moments. But noise by its nature eventually fades. Weeks passed, then months, and the public moved on to other stories, other scandals, other revelations that felt more immediate than this one. The quiet that followed was almost startling in its completeness. Harry and Meghan were left alone with what remained, sitting in the aftermath of exposure, facing the reality that had been revealed. Harry looked at his life and saw how much had changed. The truth hadn't fixed anything, but it had clarified everything. He knew now exactly where he stood, what he had, what he had lost. There was strange relief in that clarity, even though it hurt. At least he wasn't living in confusion anymore, wasn't wondering if he was imagining problems that didn't exist. The problems were real, documented, undeniable, and somehow that made them easier to face than when they had been hidden behind reassurances and vague explanations. Meghan sat in her own quiet space and wondered what she had actually won. She had the security she had fought for, the control she had needed, the financial protection she had feared living without. But the cost had been higher than she calculated. The relationship she had tried to protect through careful planning had been damaged by those very plans. Trust, once broken by revelation, doesn't easily repair itself. They stood now at different edges of the same broken path, each facing an uncertain future. There were no easy answers waiting for them, no clear solutions to what had been fractured. Harry would need to decide if he could rebuild from this position of weakness, whether he had the strength to start again with the truth as his foundation instead of hope. Meghan would need to decide if security without partnership was worth holding on to, if the protection she had secured was enough to build a future on. When the truth is finally known, where does a wounded future begin? Neither of them had the answer yet. They only knew that wherever it began, it would start from exactly where they stood now, in the clarity that comes after secrets are exposed, in the painful honesty that remains when all the pretty stories have been stripped away. The future was uncertain, but at least it would be built on truth, and perhaps that was the only place any real future could begin.